Hi, John Toshik here, Salesforce.com, Cloud Blog team. I'm here with Duncan Jones, a principal analyst with Forrester who covers the sourcing profession. Duncan, nice to meet you, and thanks for doing this interview.
Hi, John. Nice to speak with you.
Yeah. So tell me, what do you cover? What does sourcing mean, and how does it relate to what Forrester does?
Okay, so I serve people who are primarily negotiating with large software vendors, so software contracts, that sort of thing, and I help them understand the impact of technology changes on their software license agreements, help them understand how to negotiate to get the best deal, and maybe understand some of the risks about software compliance and manage their license estate more effectively.
Mm-hmm. You mostly deal with on-premise companies, is that what?
Yes,
okay.
Mostly on-premise. We at Forrester, of course, help clients with all sorts of cloud, SaaS sort of things, but I have colleagues who focus on that area. I'm dealing mainly with the large vendors of on-premise software like Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, that sort of company.
Okay, and what kind of inquiries are you getting? What kind of client calls are you getting from the vendors and from the non-vendor clients that you have?
So my focus is very much at the buyers, not the vendors. I do some work with vendors, but I'm primarily an advocate for the buyers. And a lot of companies are getting worried at the moment by the complexity of the license agreements and managing their estate. They feel like they're falling foul of rules that they don't understand. They're being audited, and they feel like some of the companies doing the audits are just out to catch them out without giving them the tools to manage their licenses properly. I've heard some clients talk about license audits as organized robbery. And so there's a lot of distrust of the large vendors out there, which is a bit of a shame, really.
Is this changing from a year ago or 5 years ago, or is it getting worse?
Yeah, I think it is, John. Firstly, there are more audits going on. Certainly with the economic downturn, there was more audit activity. But also I think the audits are encountering more problems because technology has changed so rapidly over the last few years that the traditional ways of counting software, like counting users or counting processes, just don't apply anymore. We see in things like virtualized data centers that people really struggle to apply the language in their contract to the reality of the data center. And whenever there's uncertainty, there's risk of dispute. Maybe the software vendor is interpreting the contract in one way, they interpret it in another way. Now we've got the whole issue of multi-core processors. People with per processor contracts suddenly find the vendor is saying, well, we're not counting processors anymore, we're counting cores, and they're not sure when they're
switching without actually telling the client?
Well, that's a bit of a grey area sometimes, John. Sometimes the vendor believes that it has informed the client and got the client's permission, but sometimes the client doesn't necessarily agree with that.
There's lots of fine print in there that they may not be seeing.
Yeah, so it could be, it's just the uncertainty of it sometimes, and when my client feels that the policy being applied is unfair, then they really resent that more than anything else. Fairness is the goal here, and there's a lot of software company behaviors that come across as unfair in the buyer's eyes.
Is this true of all on-premise companies? Or is it a practice? Is it a best practice? Is it a sales practice? Where do you think it's coming from?
No, it isn't. It isn't, and it isn't necessarily a practice of software companies always. Sometimes the software rep is interpreting areas of grey to his own advantage. Clients always say, oh, this company said this, or this company said that, and I always tell them, look, it's not the company, it's the individual. Sometimes if you speak to executives higher up, they have a different view of the area of grey than what the rep is portraying. So I always encourage clients to come to an expert like Forrester to say, what is really the policy here? What is fair, what is reasonable, what can I do to push back against what the rep is telling me? And between software companies, there are real differences between the basic approach. Some are trying very much harder to be friendly to buyers and to be clear and publicize the policies and explain them and make them customer friendly. whereas others seem to want to take advantage of the lack of clarity to get revenue.
Right, that could be a sales tactic, for example. At one time, it seemed like some software companies would just throw out all the software and then at the end of the year do an audit of what was used and then send a bill. Mm-hmm. And there was some kind of price shock, that happened. Mm-hmm. Is that still happening, or is it more nuanced than that?
Well, you always have that dilemma as a software company: is do you want to prevent access to your product? No, you don't. You want to help the customer get the maximum value possible out of the product. So you don't necessarily want to block them off from functions and prevent people accessing the system, but you do want to enforce your rights to your intellectual property. So you've always got this dilemma, do I prevent access, or do I allow the access and then ask the customer to pay for it? I think what really causes the problem is where the customer just has no way of complying with the rules. There aren't tools to count the things in the right way, so they don't know when they've gone beyond the license limits. They don't know if they've used a module that they haven't bought. That always seems unfair.
Where's the burden assigned to in a company? Is it procurement, or is it IT departments? Who's getting the...
That's a good question. Procurement, my client tends to be the IT procurement guy, and they get the problem when it becomes apparent. The reason there's a problem in the first place is that the responsibility hasn't been assigned to understand the rules, to tell the people in the business how to comply with the rules. So really allocating responsibility for license management is a key driver, and there's no clear owner of it, and that's usually the source of the problem.
And that's where a company like Forrester can come in and help figure it out before it happens, I assume.
We're doing a lot of work to help clients understand not just the risks involved in not managing your licenses, but understanding how can you do this effectively, what are the keys to getting in some basic controls, because if you don't have those controls in place, you're going to get audited, and if you're overusing the software, it could cost you a lot of money. So it's a big risk for companies if they don't have it under control.
Are there any sob stories or case studies that point to this at all? Without mentioning any names.
Well, without mentioning any names, there are some where some companies accidentally deployed software on PCs, got rolled out to every PC in the company. The license was based on deployment rather than usage. When they got audited, they owed a lot of money. Now that company had been kind of reckless in how it deployed the software. There are others.
But is that normal, or is that abnormal?
No, it's not that unusual, unfortunately. I mean, what's more unfortunate is where a company, didn't really deliberately break the rules. Like they had some software, they bought some server licenses, and they virtualized their data center. They didn't realize that their license didn't cover running in a virtualized environment. They didn't read the contract. They didn't look at the vendor's policy descriptions. And when they got audited, they
Who's doing the audit? The vendor comes in to audit.
The vendor comes in to do the audit. I don't have a problem with that. They have a right to enforce their intellectual property. They look at what the customer is using, and in accordance with the strict interpretation of the rules, the customer had broken the license. They didn't really mean to, but the guy in operations didn't understand the rules about virtualization, and so they thought that they hadn't increased their workload, so therefore they didn't owe any more money.
And before it was a lot of times companies sold on a per processor,
right?
But now there are multi-core processors, and there's virtualization,
right?
And there's so many nuances around that that it's just causing a lot of grief for customers,
right? Because they're looking at the wording in the contract, and it just doesn't apply to the virtualized data center. It doesn't mention cores because multi-core processors weren't invented when the contract was signed. If you get it wrong by the letter of the contract, you could owe a lot of money, 10, 15 times what you actually paid for the software.
Right, so it's not just procurement that's involved, it's IT, it's also legal apparently that has to look through these these roles.
Absolutely, and you know, who's going to get fired when this liability becomes apparent? Could be anybody.
That's very interesting. Well, it sounds like you're going to have a lifelong career dissecting this.
You know, John, a lot of the vendors ask me, you know, Duncan, how could we improve our licensing to make it simpler? And you know, I say, oh no, keep it complicated. That keeps me in work. But you know, joking aside, I think simplicity is very important because you know, my clients have to deal with so many different software companies. They have so many different rules. Technology changes all the time. You know, we've got to make this whole area simpler for companies to cope with it.
Well, great. It sounds like you're really going to be busy this year, I think, and probably the next couple of years. So that's great. I really appreciate you taking the time from your event and coming down here to the Boston Convention Center. I think we're in an empty convention area now, but upstairs it's a bustling activity. So I really appreciate you taking the time to step away from your...
You're very welcome, John. Nice to speak with you about a topic I really feel passionate about.
Excellent. It sounds like it. I really appreciate it again. Thanks, Duncan.
No problem.